Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 109 of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Hawk Blogger. And we are getting that much closer to the big moments where this season really gets going. Can't wait for Wednesday of next week, where the rookies will report, and then training camp kicks off the following week. We are going to have so much to talk about, so many people to talk to. I'm giving everybody a break for the most part this week, but we've got a bunch of folks we're going to bring back on, new folks, new faces, new interviews, all coming as we really accelerate into what will be a fresh start for your Seattle Seahawks. On today's show, one of the things that I wanted to do is somewhat of a public service, both to all of you and maybe myself, but other fans of other teams of the NFL. I don't know about you, but I find it really annoying to try to figure out what happened in another team's offseason. You have to crawl through a bunch of ad-laden articles, and they're not always complete. And I don't know. I thought that if I took a moment and walked you through a pretty rapid review of the Seahawks' very busy offseason, that'd be useful and it'd be helpful to see. So I'm going to take you through that starting right now. And before I do, I just ask you to take one quick moment and click the like button, click subscribe, show some gratitude, which I really appreciate, and also help other people find the show. And join over at patreon.com/hawkblogger, where the community continues to grow, and you can get the ad-free audio version of all the Hawk Blogger Morning podcasts, as well as access to the Slack channel where conversation is always going on. So patreon.com/hawkblogger. All right. I'm going to take you back. Oh, wow. Before I even do that, we've already got a super chat from Hawks fan Matt Man, who is a YouTube member as well. Matt says, I caught up on Tuesday's show earlier this morning and wanted to say, congrats on your big career decision. Now I'm even more excited for the season. That is very nice of you. Thank you for the super chat, Matt. For folks that don't know what Matt's referring to, I spent 26, 27 years in tech. I have been like a product leader for many years, VP of, a startup, worked at Adobe, all these things, and made the decision very recently really just a couple days ago, to bow out of all the job opportunities that have been approaching me on the tech side, to return to certain companies, to start at new places, and to focus at least through this season on Seahawks football. Used to be a long time ago a print journalism major, wanted to be a sports writer, a sports journalist, didn't go that route for a variety of reasons, and have decided to give it a go later in life and see how far I can go and see what kind of content I can create and what kind of community I can bring along with me. So I'm really, really excited about this season, and I hope that you all are too. And I really appreciate the support, Matt, and all of our YouTube members. So now let me set the stage. Getting back to the show topic itself. January 7th of this year, the Seahawks were still playing football. Pete Carroll was the head coach, and they were down in Arizona playing the Arizona Cardinals, and an absolute silly set of events occurred in what ended up being Pete Carroll's last game as a Seahawk. I can actually go through it really quickly because I think it's kind of crazy. The Seahawks gave up a touchdown with about, I don't know, 9 minutes, 10 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. Kyler Murray passed to Trey McBride, and Arizona went ahead 20-13. Looked like that was the way the game was going to end. But Geno Smith, like he is wont to do, led a led a drive all the way. It was a, 67-yard drive for a touchdown on a pass to Tyler Lockett for 34 yards, a gorgeous pass. And the Seahawks were down 20-19, and they decided to go for two. And they completed the 2-point attempt. Geno passed Tyler Lockett again for a 21-20 lead with under 2 minutes to go in the game. Then the Cardinals got the ball and they drove, and they got down to the Seahawks 30-yard line before Kyler Murray was sacked by Darrell Taylor. And then James Conner was tackled behind the line of scrimmage. And Arizona still had Matt Prater to kick a 51-yard field goal, very makeable field goal in an easy place to kick. And he missed the field goal. So that series of events led to Arizona getting a higher pick in the draft, ultimately turned in Marvin Harrison Jr., the Seahawks getting a lower pick in the draft. We'll talk about what happened with that in a second. But it did send Pete Carroll out as a winner, which was cool. But at that point, on January 7th, Pete Carroll had told Brock Heward, Mike Salk, and actually, let's look at the calendar so I can give you the exact dates. I care about these things. You may not. But if we look at January 8th, the next day, the Monday, Pete Carroll told Brock Heward and Mike Salk on his morning show that he had every intention to be back as the Seahawks coach and that he was excited about where the team was going. Well, 2 days later, January 10th, Pete Carroll held a press conference that he was leaving and no longer going to be with the Seahawks, that he was going to be a advisor. And I was going to play some of the sound, but I don't know that anyone needs to get teary-eyed on the start of their Thursday. So I won't go over that. But Pete Carroll, after 14 years, the most successful head coach in Seahawks history, Super Bowl winner, multiple Super Bowl visits, was out as head coach. John Schneider was going to remain as GM. And that was really the kickoff for what was an incredibly busy offseason. So that was January 10th. Okay. A couple other things happened along the way. Won't get into all the detail, but practice squad changes. I don't think we need to get into that as much. But by January 31st, so a couple of weeks later, Mike Macdonald was hired as head coach. And if we go through and look at more specifics on the date there, I think it's kind of fun to remind ourselves. The Baltimore Ravens played a game on January 28th against the Kansas City Chiefs, and they lost that game by 1 touchdown, 17-10. Mike Macdonald's defense held the Chiefs scoreless in the second half of that game. But it wasn't enough. So January 28th, he was done as the season ended for Baltimore. 3 days later, Mike Macdonald was hired on January 31st as the next head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. Also, on the very same day, the Seahawks signed Lance Boykin to a futures contract. Almost as big of a deal, but not quite. So that's January 31st. Um. Ooh, are we getting breaking news? Hold on one second, folks. We might need to switch gears. Yes, we are getting breaking news. Jamal Adams has agreed to terms on a deal with the Tennessee Titans. This is being reported by Turon Davenport as well as Field Yates. And this is a meaningful bit of news. I won't go deep on this, but I do want to make sure folks are aware. Jamal Adams has signed with the Tennessee Titans. This was the most likely veteran addition to that off-ball linebacking crew. We heard Mike McDonald and we heard John Schneider all talk about being open to bringing him back. He is not coming back. That is the door closing on Jamal Adams as a Seahawk, which fits into this offseason recap as a case may be. But that means that no longer will that be an option for the Seahawks. And if they are going to add another linebacker, it will come either via trade. And if those are interested in trade options, I did a show on potential trade candidates for the Seahawks at the linebacker position. You can look for that on the channel. And there's also in there some veteran additions, some free agent additions. So Jamal Adams signs with the Tennessee Titans. Big news there. All right, let's keep going. So 3 days after the Ravens were out of the playoffs, Mike McDonald became the new Seahawks head coach. On February 13th, just 2 weeks later, the Seahawks announced that Aden Dirty would become the new defensive coordinator. Ryan Grubb, formerly of University of Washington and briefly of Alabama, would become the new offensive coordinator. Jay Harbaugh, an acquaintance from Mike McDonald's at University of Michigan, would become the new special teams coordinator. And maybe most importantly, Leslie Frazier would become the assistant head coach. Other coaching pieces that were pretty important, Scott Huff would come along with Ryan Grubb, who had worked with him as the offensive line coach at University of Washington. He would come to the Seahawks to be the new offensive line coach. The other two coaches that were announced then, Kirk Olivadotti from the Packers as the new linebackers coach, and Carl Scott would remain. He's the only coach that would remain from the coaching staff of the Seahawks had last year as the defensive passing game coordinator and defensive backs coach. A couple days later, they named David Fitzsimmons the assistant special teams coach. By February 22nd, so about 10 days after all the coordinators were hired, you got the next level of hires. Mac Brown was hired as tight ends coach. Josh Bynes was hired as a defensive assistant linebackers coach. Rob Caprice was hired as an intern on defense. Zach Hill was hired as an offensive assistant quality control coach. Justin Hines, who was an assistant defensive line coach for the Bears, would come and be the defensive line coach here. Jeff Howard came on for safeties, Frisman Jackson for wide receivers, Charles London for quarterbacks. Brendan Nugent, one of the key secondary hires, not of the secondary, but he's an assistant line coach. He has been an offensive line coach for the Chargers. He would be an assistant for Scott Huff. Quishon Odom came on as an offensive assistant quality control on the offensive line. Chris Partridge would come on for outside linebackers. Jake Peets became an offensive passing game coordinator. Peets came from spending a couple years with Sean McVay. So that was a pretty big hire and has had experience at LSU as a offensive coordinator. And I believe, I want to say, where was it? Alabama, maybe? I don't know. I'd have to double check on Mr. Pete's, but let me do that real quick. I'm curious. Yeah, Alabama and LSU. I got it right the first time. So Jake Peetz was a pretty key hire. Nick Perry came along as a defensive quality control coach. Kennedy Polamalu for running backs, one of the more respected running backs coaches in the league, and Tyson Prince as an assistant wide receivers coach. So essentially, the Seahawks went from January 10th announcing that Pete Carroll would no longer remain with the team to, by the end of January 31st, hiring their new head coach, Mike Macdonald. And in less than a month, he had hired his entire coaching staff. So by February 22nd, all those coaches had been hired. So if you hadn't kept up with that, was a big kind of crazy time. Those are all the coaches, and there's a lot of coaches in there that are going to be pretty impactful names that you might not know. The Jay Harbaugh hire is going to be very interesting. We've talked a ton about Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff. Kirk Olivadotti as the inside linebackers coach is very interesting that he was one of the first hires and has a lot of experience. It's also interesting that the Packers did not block him from taking a lateral move. And the Packers have not had the best inside linebacker crew the last few years. So one to watch. I think the other ones that I mentioned that are I think Justin Hines is an up-and-comer on the defensive line, and he's going to have a lot of people to work with. Aden Dirty, who is the DC in name at least, although Mike Macdonald will be calling the plays, comes from a defensive line background as well. So you got a lot of defensive line expertise with Hines and Aden Dirty. Frisman Jackson is a pretty well-known wide receivers coach. Brendan Nugent, the assistant offensive line coach, he brings a ton of NFL experience that Scott Huff can integrate with. And then Jake Peetz, I mentioned, and Kennedy Polamalu. I think Jake Peetz is going to be a name we're going to want to learn more about. I think his background coming from the Rams and Sean McVay, you better believe that Mike Macdonald is picking his brain, knowing that Sean McVay has been a very challenging opponent for him during his time as a defensive leader. So February 22nd, coaching staff set. Now, a few weeks go by. It comes to March 5th. This was D-Day for a number of longtime Seahawks from a cap situation perspective. Jamal Adams, who is now a Tennessee Titan, if you missed that earlier, Jamal Adams was cut. Quandre Diggs, cut. And Will Dissly, released. All these guys were released. Technical term, they were released. So the starting safety pair for the Seahawks, two of the most expensive players on the salary cap, were released, and then Will Dissly was as well. The next day, the team released Brian Monet, the nose tackle, who had been a pretty good player for the Seahawks, but had suffered a pretty serious injury and never really recovered, was not able to come back last year. He is still not signed with any team as far as I know. 5 days later, on March 11th, the Seahawks released Nick Bellore, longtime beloved Seattle Seahawk Nick Bellore. I don't know if between two Bellores or whatever that was that he did is still going to happen for fun, but I don't know if Bellore is signed anywhere. I haven't checked that out, but he is no longer a Seahawk. And then the Seahawks started adding. Free agency began, and they made Leonard Williams their number one priority. Leonard Williams was their first free agent signing of the offseason, signed to a deal that averaged $21.5 million a year. The very next day, on day 2, the Seahawks re-signed Noah Fant and signed Rayshawn Jenkins. So people may not realize or not remember that Rayshawn Jenkins was signed that early in free agency. Rayshawn Jenkins had also been a salary cap casualty from the Jaguars. So he had been able to tour teams for a little bit, but he signed on day 2 of free agency. On day 3 of free agency, the Seahawks signed Pharaoh Brown, the tight end from the Patriots, Tyrell Dodson from the Bills, George Fant, swing tackle and Nick Harris, backup center. The next day, so this was 4 days into free agency, the Seahawks traded one of their third round picks, the 78th pick in the draft, and a 5th round pick for the Washington Commanders' 4th round pick, 6th round pick, and Sam Howell. So this was a big move in the Seahawks offseason where they added their hopeful quarterback of the future, a player in Sam Howell who is younger than many of the quarterbacks drafted in the draft this year. He's 23 and has already started 18 games in the NFL. He comes to Seattle for what was the equivalent of roughly a 5th round pick in total cost. Interestingly, on the same day, quieter move by far, but the Seahawks re-signed Artie Burns, the cornerback. So a player that played relatively well in the slot, as well as in the nickel, as well as in on the outside, but is a veteran, like he's 29 or so, he's late 20s, brought him back. By day 5 of free agency, the Seahawks signed Jerome Baker. So this was their big move to pair with Tyrell Dodson to replace Bobby Wagner and Jordan Brooks, longtime duo back there. So Tyrell Dodson and Jerome Baker become the new inside linebacker, off-ball linebacker pairing. Then the Seahawks start, looking around. At this point, the only players they had added for the offensive line were George Fant and Nick Harris, both of whom were expected to be backups. And they'd lost Damian Williams and lost Evan Brown, who had been their starting center. And obviously we're not going to bring back, 41-year-old Jason Peters. We're not sure what was going to go on with Abraham Lucas recovering. So there's a lot of questions on the offensive line. George Fant was kind of the one guy that had starting potential, but that was all that had happened. By March 18th, the Seahawks signed Tremaine Ankrum, the never played before backup guard from the Rams. And who knows? Maybe Jake Peetz knows something about him from his time on the Rams. Maybe Brandon Nugent knows something. Maybe somebody has some information about Tremaine Ankrum, but that was a concerning signing given the real desire to find a more starting caliber guard to add to the roster. A couple days later, the Seahawks signed Jonathan Hankins and Kayvon Wallace. March 20th might end up being a pretty big day for the Seahawks, depending on how this season unfurls. Hankins could be a key part of revamping this run defense. Aden Dirty recruited him hard and had experience with him in Dallas. And Hankins has been clear that the reason he's in Seattle is because of Dirty. So he's going to be, I think, a big part of that overhauled defensive line and run defense. And Kayvon Wallace is a guy that John Schneider said he did not expect to be available. I have to admit, at the time, I kind of was like, well, that sounds like GM talk. But as I've dug in more to Kayvon Wallace and watched more of him play, I think he is going to be a pretty dynamic third safety. And if you heard the show I did with Cody Alexander, he has Kayvon Wallace as a top 20 safety in the NFL, and something to watch as a third safety. So then some time passes and you get into April. The Seahawks on April 2nd, so well after free agency had been, going on for almost a month at that point. They signed Laviska Shenault Jr. And we've heard very little about Laviska Shenault. Not clear if he's going to just be a returner, if he's going to be someone that they actually look at as a screen pass, kind of yards after catch guy. We will see. The Seahawks signed their restricted and exclusive rights free agents. So they brought back Michael Jackson, the cornerback, John Radigan, the linebacker. They signed their exclusive rights free agents, Miles Adams, defensive end, McClendon Curtis, who, as guard, was the starting guard during OTAs at right guard. Raekwon O'Neal. Raekwon O'Neal and McClendon Curtis were practice squad players that the Seahawks signed off of other teams' practice squads last year, kept them all last year, and now those guys were retained. Defensive end Josh Onajagu and tight end Brady Russell were also signed as exclusive rights free agents. From there, the Seahawks signed tackle Max Percher, who is, I would assume, is going to be a camp body, but worth just being aware of. But more importantly, on April 15th, the Seahawks finally signed their veteran starting caliber offensive guard, Laken Tomlinson. It was not the name that most people were looking for, but it is the name that they called out, and it is who is now slated to be the starting left guard for the Seahawks. All right. So that is April 15th. Then we get to the NFL draft. April 25th, the Seahawks, with the 16th pick in the draft, select Byron Murphy of University of Texas. On April 26th, the Seahawks select Christian Haynes out of UConn, the guard, who is the odds-on expected favorite for Seattle. We'll see if it happens out of camp or not, but he's expected to be a starter at right guard. And then on the final day of the draft, late April, the Seahawks selected Tyrese Knight, linebacker out of UTEP, AJ Barner, tight end from Michigan, Nehemiah Pritchett, cornerback from Auburn, Satawa Lamea, guard from Utah, DJ James, the other cornerback from Auburn, and Michael Jarrell, a tackle from Findlay. So, I mean, that is going from January 10th to April 27th. You know, you get entire new coaching staff. Free agency was relatively quiet. The big moves in free agency were re-signing Leonard Williams, but the biggest external net new names added to the team through the free agent period were Rayshawn Jenkins, Pharaoh Brown, potentially, Tyrell Dodson and Jerome Baker, both expected to be starters, Sam Howell, who will expected to be the backup quarterback, and then probably George Fant. I mentioned Jonathan Hankins and Kayvon Wallace, but again, those guys are, not necessarily expected to play a ton of snaps. We'll see. Laken Tomlinson is on that list, but he's also expected to be a starter. But then you add Byron Murphy and Christian Haynes, who are guys that you expect to potentially be starters, or at least guys that get significant snaps and contribute immediately this year. From there, I think that the piece that is worth calling out in terms of moves the Seahawks have made this offseason is some of the undrafted free agents. The Seahawks signed Nelson Caesar, edge player out of Houston, who is highly thought of. They signed Garrett Greenfield, tackle out of South Dakota State that a lot of teams were bidding for. They signed George Halani, running back out of Boise State, who has a very, very good chance of making this roster. They signed Jack Westover, who played for Ryan Grubb as a tight end in Washington. I'm going to see if there's anyone else that I think qualifies as a big name to know there. But I think those were the big, relatively large, like the guys that got some guaranteed money to sign. So that brings us to today, where we are roughly a week away from the Seahawks kicking off training camp. They have seen a situation where, if you want to know, the people that have exited from the Seahawks from last year, the guys that at least played significant amounts of snaps, it's easier to start from defense and move to offense. As far as total snaps, Bobby Wagner, Quandre Diggs, Jordan Brooks, Jamal Adams, Mario Edwards Jr., Devin Bush, Frank Clark, all gone. All right. Those guys are all on the team last year, played some meaningful snaps. They are all no longer with the team. On offense, the Seahawks said goodbye to, in order of most snaps to least, Evan Brown, Damian Lewis, 2/5 of their starting offensive line. They said goodbye to Colby Parkinson, who signed with the Rams. They said goodbye to Phil Haynes, who started a number of games at guard for them last year. You could say that 3/5 of their starting offensive line were let go. They said goodbye to Will Dissly. They said goodbye to Jake Curran, Jason Peters, Drew Lock, DJ Dallas. All gone. So those are all the players that they say goodbye to. And we talked about already the players that they welcomed in. So busy offseason for the Seahawks. A lot of change. By far the biggest changes from my perspective are on the coaching side, followed by Byron Murphy. Like those are the big real changes for this team if you were to recap it. And then also the safety position, I think is going to be significantly different than it was. The linebacker position is going to be significantly different than it was. And we'll see on the offensive line. That is essentially the recap of the Seahawks 2024 offseason. Hope that was helpful to kind of go back and remind everybody about where we were and where we're going to be. There's a question here from Matt. I always try to answer club level and above YouTube members' questions live. He says, is there a single player we no longer have from last year that you'll really miss? It's a great question. I mean, Bobby's a guy that I have a ton of respect for and will always cheer for. So I'll miss having him on the team. I do understand why he's not, and I think it might be for the best for both parties. Other than Bobby, I mean, similarly, like I loved Quandre as a person. I just was ready for a change there. So no, I don't think there. Yeah, I don't really think so. I don't really think so. I was not a huge Damian Lewis fan. I was not a huge Jordan. I mean, I like Jordan Brooks, but I was not nearly the fanatic about him that other folks are. So no, there's really nobody that I think that's part of the reason I'm so optimistic about this offseason is that the players that they say goodbye to, I think were all wise decisions. And the players that they welcomed in, almost all seem like very wise decisions. Let me see if there's any other notes here. Here's a comment from Peter Jacobson, one of our newer YouTube members, says, mild take. Howell might be the QB of the future, but doubt he's Oh, he might be the QB in the future, but doubt he's QB of the future. Team needed a backup and they got one. We'll see. I think Sam Howell has some really special talents. I think having a year working behind, or 2 years working behind Geno Smith and working with Ryan Grubb could really up his game. I think he's got a lot of physical tools. I think he's got the guts, the savvy. I don't think it's crazy that he could end up being a QB of the future. I don't think you have to like assume it, but I do think there's a real potential there. All right. With that, folks, all the folks that love the shorter shows are happy today. Gonna let you out of here after a quick one. Please remember to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And I will be back tomorrow with more. So take care, everybody. Until then, I'm Brian Nemhauser. This has been episode 109 of Hawkwater Mornings.